Hi, I am Rachel Riley and I'm here for the Holocaust Educational Trust to talk to a Holocaust survivor, the wonderful Hannah Lewis. And the Holocaust Educational Trust goes around the country educating young people about what happened those many years ago. And we're speaking to you today because of your experience many, many years ago, Hannah. So tell me, where were you born and what was life like for you as a child?
Okay, well, I was born in a small market town in Poland called Włodawa nad Bugiem, which means Włodawa on the River Bug. And it was a very apt thing because the other side was actually Belarus. My family were well entrenched there. We all lived in the same sort of house with a shop underneath, which was their shop. And we lived above the shop, more or less, but it was very nice. My father met my mother when she came into the shop to buy some shoes. And for him, he said it was love at first sight.
I like how you say for him. Does that mean it wasn't for your mother?
No, I think she went in there to buy shoes. And he said that she found a pair of shoes that was obviously too expensive for her. So he changed the labels. And apparently that was the beginning of the beginning of a romance.
Did he experience anti-Semitism?
Well, he used to go to Warsaw and to Krakow, and he heard what was happening. And he came back and he said, you know, I don't like the sound of this young man called Hitler. Mm-hmm. I think that the family should emigrate. Mm-hmm. And my grandmother wouldn't hear of it. And she said, no one's going to come here. Mm-hmm. How wrong she was.
And could you see, was it a gradual thing?
It was fairly gradual. I remember that our house began to fill up with people. Yeah. And I remember that the shop was closed.
Mm-hmm. And the shop was closed under the laws that...
Well, the German presence was at first very, very small. Mm-hmm. But it started that there was a curfew.
Just for Jews?
Yes, just the Jews. But by this time, there was nowhere to go by this time.
So at this time, you were still living in your family home?
We were still in our family home, except we were actually sleeping in the shop. And we had people who came from greater, you know, the more bigger towns, started to come to Włodawa because they thought it was safer, because by this time everything was closed.
And you weren't allowed to go to school?
No, I never went to school till after the war. No. Wow. But our house began to fill up with people coming from bigger towns, because they thought, for the comparative safety of a small town, they thought they wouldn't get there. So my mother I remember, used to make boiled milk, and she cut cubes of bread into it. And I remember looking and saying, why do you have so many? And she said, there are many children here now. So food was difficult. And the people who were coming in from the centre of Poland were telling of terrible things, of concentration camps and forced labour camps and crematoria. I didn't know what it meant, but I heard it. I mean, I was at the stage where when I was with my mummy and my daddy and my family, everything was fine. But I do remember the first time we actually left home for a couple of days. And it was because they heard that there was going to be an action. And we got to a big barn in the middle of nowhere, and we were there that night. And the next morning, and I think it wasn't meant, suddenly the door to the barn opened, and I was sitting on my mother, and I looked down, and through the rafters I could look through, and all I could see was the tip of a cap and the boots. and there were Germans, and we all froze. I don't think they were searching for us. I think they saw a barn and they went to have a look. But I could see, as I said, the top of the caps and the shoes. And they went away. And when we actually left, I remember my mother getting up and I looked at her back and she must have been lying on nails because there were clots of blood all over. And she said, "Don't worry, that's fine." And we went back home.
And how did things escalate?
Well, things escalated because more and more Jews came from the other side of Poland and they started telling us about the camps. And I remember the day we were rounded up. Adampol was a small, pretty village. It was fields surrounded by woods, and most of the houses were wooden houses. There was no electricity, and there was no running water. Gradually, our family was decimated. My uncle Shulka, by the time we got to Adampol, they took one look at him. He had a squint. He didn't speak. They took him out, and we never saw him again. I can only describe the accommodation as sheds. You slept on what I call trays. There were two lots of bunks, and they were hard, and each level there were three people. There were the women and the men. And my mother was amazing like that. She slept on the very edge, so there was more room for me. And she was always there for me. The bunks were horrible. The place was horrible. And what they used to do is they used to hire out Jewish labor to work in fields, to work in factories. They would be paid. The Jews would do the work and they would take the money. And on one of these times, my father and his cousin managed to escape. And my father told me that he knew that there were partisan groups in the woods and places round. There was a question of finding them.
So it was you, your cousin and your mum?
So it was my mum and I and my little cousin, Shlomo, because by that time, my uncle Shulka was killed from the beginning because he wasn't right. And then Malka just died probably of starvation.
That was his mother, was it?
Malka, her name was Malka. And that was my cousin's mother. So Shlomo was with us, and I looked after him. And he was also deaf and mute. We were doing something outside, and I suddenly realized that I could hear something, and it was the clip-clop of horses. So I understood that this wasn't good. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was safer if I wasn't seen. So I got hold of Shlomo's hand, as I always did, and I squeezed it. And we would always go into the first barn that was safe, and we dive into the hay. And this particular time, that's what happened. But I held his hand, I pushed the door open. I mean, I wasn't that tall, but I pushed it open. And I ran to the back of the barn and dived into the hay. And I thought Shlomo was with me. And I felt around, and he wasn't. And I could hear them. He couldn't hear them. I could hear them. They were yelling and screaming and talking, and I was feeling round. And then suddenly the door opened. They always banged on the door. and he was hiding at the top. And it's a guilt I've always had. I knew I couldn't get to him because I could hear them. And seeing him picked up by the scruff of his neck, and I could see his feet kicking, is something I've never forgotten. And I never saw him again. And then, in a funny way, that was a catalyst. Then I really understood the war. And I always felt guilty that I didn't save him.
And you both would have been about 5 years old, 6 years old, maybe?
I was probably 6 at that stage. It was the last winter of the war. Anyway, it was the last winter of the war, and I got very sick, really sick. My father had disappeared with the partisans. And one of the things the partisans did, apart from sabotage and trying to survive, was to warn people in camps if they knew there was going to be an action. It was, as I said, we didn't know it, but it was the last winter of the war. Yeah. And I got really sick, and my mother was desperate. She didn't have medication. It wasn't healthy to be in the sheds that they were in, and there wasn't a doctor to do anything. So she asked the nice niece to ask her uncle whether just for one night we might sleep on the kitchen floor by a pietz. A pietz was an oven that it was tiled from floor to ceiling with a door that opened, and it was on all the time. And my mother used to cook there and bake there, and it heated the house. And the old man said, okay. So that night, she made a bed as best she could, as near to the oven as she could, and we settled. And this was the back of the house, which faced the camp. And I was restless, and she was restless, because she did the best she could, but we were both restless. And sometime during the night, there was a tap, tap, tap on the window. And at first, my father said that he thinks that's what happened. My mother must have thought that it was a branch or something. And so she got up, because she obviously didn't want anybody else to wake up, and went to the window. And my father said that the window was so cold that it was almost like frosted glass. You couldn't see. Yeah. So she had to open it. By this time, I'm really up and waiting for her to come back. So I got up and I also walked, but I didn't go all the way to the window. And there in the window was my father. He had a beret on, and it was a very quick conversation. I remembered it, but I asked him after, many years later, was this what you said? And he said, Haya, you must come. He said, there's an action tomorrow. And she said, I can't, Hanetka's not well. And he said, bring her with. She said, she won't make it. And whether it was a searchlight or a patrol, I don't know. I just know that she closed the window and she came and laid beside me. To this day, I can't even imagine what went through her mind and whether she made the right decision. Because early the next morning, the signs and the sounds of the Einsatzgruppen came quick and fast. And there were shouted screams and yells and orders, and we were just lying there. And then suddenly there was this whack on the door. And my mother I've never forgotten her at that point, very calmly, got on her knees, took me in her arms, gave me a huge hug and kiss, got up, and she didn't sleep in her 90s. And she walked to the door, opened it, and closed it behind her. And I waited for her to come back. But she didn't come back. And there was more yelling and shouting. So I decided I would go and look for her. And my mother and I always made eye contact. So I remember it was freezing cold. It was concrete, and I'd had no shoes on. And I was dressed anyway, the way I was dressed. And at first, I didn't see her. Didn't see her at all. And there were Germans yelling and screaming and shouting. And suddenly, I saw her. And she was with some other people, and they were being lined up by the well. Now, the well was the well that she went to 5-6 times a day to get water. And I couldn't understand it. I'm looking at her. She's not even glancing at the house. It's as if I weren't there. So I decided that I would go and take her hand the way I always did. And before I could do it, somebody yelled out an order, and they started to shoot, and it was winter. It was the last winter of the war. And I saw her fall, and I saw the blood on the snow, and I knew why she wasn't looking at me, and I knew that I mustn't make a sound. And all I could remember is going back and lying down on that pellet in the kitchen. And when I came to, Sala, the nice niece, was trying to pour hot milk down my throat. And it was awful, because by this time I was in the camp. I came out every day, and it was protected in a way. I would help with the weeding, I would help with whatever they wanted, and I would do whatever needed, whatever. But I was on my own. And then suddenly we were being shelled. The Russians were coming, and the war. When we were still interned, there were Jews in Krakow having coffee, because we were one of the last ones to be liberated. And people started coming out of the woods, and they told tales of who was where and where they saw them, and who survived and who they knew didn't survive. But no one came for me. And then one day, there he was. There was my father. Dirty, skinny, but my father. And when he saw me, he hugged and he kissed me and he laughed and he cried. And, you learn to sort of heal yourself. And I decided in that interim, when my mother was taken out, that she wasn't really dead, that she was injured, because sometimes this happened, and that my father had been there the night before, and he must have taken her. He must have taken her with him, And it kept me going. And then when he appeared from nowhere, skinny, dirty, my father, I was thrilled. And I remember he hugged and he kissed me and he hugged, and I kept looking around. And I kept thinking that my mother must be with him. He must have taken her. And I remember he wanted a bit of peace and quiet, so he took my hand and we walked out of the village. And there were sort of these stones that told you how many kilometres you were or whatever. And he sat on it and he put me on his lap. And I still said to him, "Where's Mama?" Poor man. He looked at me and he said, "Hanechka, Mama's not coming back." I said, "No, no, no, no. You came, you took her." He said, "No, Hanechka. Mama died." And I literally clammed up. I don't know how long it was, but he was absolutely desperate. He kept shaking me. He told me afterwards that he thought that the deaf and mute thing that was prevalent in our family, well, not to the great extent, that this had happened to me, that the shock had happened to me. I literally didn't say a word. I didn't respond to anything. I just sat there. And eventually, I said, "But you came to get Mama. You were in the barn." And he said, "No, Hanechka." He saw it, but he couldn't help. And it was, to this day, one of the worst things I've ever heard. Eventually, we left Adampole. We then went back to whatever, and our house was occupied, and the people who occupied didn't give a monkey that it was our house.
And they were German, Poles?
No, they were Poles. I think they were Poles. The fact was that it wasn't our house. And then I think we slept on the. It was a time when you slept on other people's floors. And then my father took me to Lublin. I'd never been to Lublin. And we spent one winter there, and I remember hating it. My father must have had the most terrible time because he wasn't equipped for anything. He was a businessman without a business again. Yeah. My grandfather's sisters were looking for us. And one day somebody said, "You know, on the board in the synagogue, it looks like somebody with your name or knowing your name is looking for you." So my father went and had a look, and it was his father's two sisters who were in London. And they were asking if there were any survivors.
Yeah.
So my father...
So how long after the war would this have
This
been?
must have been about a year after the war, because I was going to school then. And so my father got in touch, and he found that it was his two aunts. One lived in Edgware and one lived in Hendon, and they were looking. So they started a whole correspondence, and they got together. You know, they wanted to help get me out, but it was very difficult. And again, I always think when anything good happened, my mother had a hand in it. One day there was a knock on the door, and I opened the door, and there were two very elegant men, and they asked, "Did we live there?" And I said, "Yes." Was my father there? And I said, "No, but he's coming." And they said that they knew our cousins, and they had given us, they'd given him the address and so on, and asked to look us up. And this all happened because, as I said, it was a new suburb, it was Edgware, and one of the young men was playing table tennis with my father's cousin. And he said, look, I can't finish this game because I'm going to Poland tomorrow. And he said, really? We've got a little cousin there. Would you look her up? So from a little thing like that, and they looked us up, and they were amazing to me and to my father.
So they were British Jews?
They were Jewish. They lived in London, and they were trading with Poland. So they had a lot of leeway. And they said they would like to help. The first thing they did, and I once asked Basil, I said, I can't believe it. He gave us money, gave my father money. He said, you must buy your daughter a nice coat and nice clothes. Your aunt and uncle sent the money. I asked Auntie. She didn't send the money. It was their money. And so they came 2 or 3 times, and it was quite brutal. The third time, we had about 3 days. My visa came through, so they must have bribed someone. And I was on a train with them and my father. They were also going to Czechoslovakia because they were trading with Czechoslovakia as well. My father came on the train with us. At the border to Czechoslovakia, they literally physically had to drag him out of the train because he didn't have a passport. He couldn't go. He was crying. I was crying. I can't remember what these poor young men must have thought about it. But my father was not allowed to come with me. And I remember getting to Prague and thinking I died and gone to heaven. Prague was never bombed. And it was intact. And it was a beautiful day. And then it was time to come to England. I was very happy with my great aunt and uncle. They were wonderful to me. And I remember the night that I came in from the train, Basil and Bernard took me there. The house sort of stood, the road was higher and the path sort of came down. So it was, when you opened the door, you could see the hedges, but it was higher and you went in. And I remember coming in, and the hall was like a room, and it had books and paintings on it. And it felt almost subterranean. And I've never forgotten it. The record that was playing as I came in was Tino Rossi singing Santa Lucia. And whenever I hear Santa Lucia, I think of that. It was a very difficult time. I must have been a nightmare, and they were wonderful. But I settled in. And the very odd thing that I've always queried, that in all the time that I was there and the family came and they met, nobody ever asked me what happened. It was as if I had some terrible disease or disfigurement that it was kinder not to notice. So I never told. I didn't see my father for probably 7 or 8 years.
And did you, I mean, obviously you and your father both had so much trauma. There's a word bandied around, but
I don't think we ever really got it together.
And how has it been? I mean, you've told your story a number of times now, and you speak to young people and educate them. Were the memories on the surface, or did it bring back a lot of things that you hadn't thought about for many years?
I think I've learned to live with it as a part of me. It can't be shelved. It won't go away. But as I said, somebody once said, do you tell your story because you hate the Germans so much? And I said, no, I tell the story because I care for you so much. So you have to beware of charisma. It works both ways. And be aware of what people can do with impunity, if they can. Not all, but you need to know that this happened. We weren't at war. We were just the wrong people.
You mentioned for many years after the Holocaust, you didn't talk about experiences nobody asked. And I think it's kind of the 1980s where in this country, Holocaust education started as a thing and people started listening to survivors. Obviously, in the 90s, Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List was huge, and it brought it into the homes of not just Jews, but everybody was more aware. So what prompted you to start speaking?
Well, Schindler's List, in a funny way, was probably also one of the things that made me think that I should start saying or telling, because the little girl in the red coat reminded me of me. She also knew when to hide and when to walk. And it hit my friends and people that film was a very important film. It brought it into your minds and into your homes, and it was discussed. Yeah. But as I said, I knew when to walk and I knew when to run. And this little girl reminded me of me.
And what's it like as a survivor hearing other survivors tell their stories?
Well, sometimes I hear stories that are so awful that I almost thank God for mine. And I think they're amazing. Most of them, against all odds, survived, found their equilibrium, done good. They haven't forgotten, but they've got on with life. They made the most of it. I think life is so precious, we take it for granted. It's when it's threatened, not because you're ill and God forbid you're having treatment, but if it's something you're scared of every day, it's awful. It's just awful.
I think I've known, growing up with Jewish family, I can't remember a time I didn't know about the Holocaust. And as a child, you hear the stories about the children, and you may be able to empathise slightly with the children. And as I've become a mother, you think about
it's a different thing.
It's a different thing, and you feel it from different angles, the different people that suffered at different times of their lives. And I'm just wondering how I'm kind of facing the questions now where you thinking, how am I ever going to explain this to my children? How do you explain it to people? How do you...
Well, when I was really sure that everything that I remembered was as I remembered and not a figment of my imagination or something I heard, and my children were older, I sat them down and I told them.
And did they just have lots of questions? Were they silent like you were when you were told by your father?
I think they absorbed it. I think they absorbed it. It obviously damaged me, but I think survivors are quite resilient. You have to learn with what happened because you can't change it, but it can't be the story of your life.
Do you think there's too heavy a burden on Holocaust survivors and on Jewish people to tell this story? Do you think it's something that everyone should be listening to so that it doesn't happen again in any society?
Well, the fact is that it's happening all over the world, and I find that very sad. And I think anybody who's a perpetrator always has their own reason for why it's okay for them to be a perpetrator. Because I can't believe that they can enjoy, well, maybe they do enjoy being a perpetrator. Maybe power corrupts and absolute power is absolute corruption. I don't know.
I'm just wondering if you're on social media at all, if you're aware of some of the...
No, I don't do any of this. I think I'm too old for that.
I think that's wise. I don't think you're too old, but I think it's wise.
Why is it so awful?
I think there's things I wonder how you feel sometimes when people, maybe on the spectrum of things, minor things, but when they explain, whether it's a lockdown or a vaccination or a football match as a Holocaust, using that language and invoking Hitler and the Nuremberg laws.
You cannot compare that. The thing that I found so horrendous about the Nuremberg and Hitler is that it wasn't done in anger. Mm-hmm. It wasn't done by people who were ignorant. Mm-hmm. It was backed by people that you would sit and have dinner with, mm-hmm. or you'd meet and you'd like, and they might be your neighbours, and suddenly you're not the person that you were. Not because you're not, but because they decided that you're not. And
were you from a religious family, or?
I don't think we were religious. I think we were observant. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've never, ever not been aware that I'm Jewish, and I don't want to be anything other than Jewish, not because I think we're better than anybody or worse than anybody, but that's just because that we are. Yeah. We're Jews, and I'm very happy to be Jewish.
Yeah, I think for me, actually, because we're very secular, but growing up being aware of the Holocaust, I think for me it's important to retain that part of my identity and to give it to my children. Not just because, but a large part of it is that someone was so determined to eradicate it from the planet, and you have it to share and to give it to your children. I find, for me, it's a really important reason.
I was careful to tell them when I thought they were old enough to absorb it in the right way. And as I said, I didn't teach them hatred. I'd like to say that I taught them just to look out.
And my experience of anti-Semitism, modern day anti-Semitism, it has all the same flavours as the old school anti-Semitism, but they'll say, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm not anti-Jewish, I'm just anti-Zionist.
Oh, well, they've got another horse to ride, haven't they? They'll find something.
Do you see the parallels in some of the rhetoric used now and some of the rhetoric?
It's worrying, but I think that by and large, if we're talking about Britain, mm-hmm. Britain is a very fair country. And like every other country, it has the odd people, the strange people, the scaremongers. Mm-hmm. It goes across the whole range. But by and large, my experience of Britain has been wonderful. It gave me a home, it gave me a life, mm-hmm. and I always felt safe in Britain. And I still feel safe. I know there's anti-Semitism. It's sometimes under the cover of all sorts of reasons why they feel the way they feel. Mm-hmm. I don't know why we seem to rub people's backs the wrong way. I don't know why. But I mean, there are so many different factions in the world now. And the other thing is that news spreads so quickly. Everything spreads so quickly. There are no great secrets. So if people want to write or say something horrible about you, they put it on the website or something, and you can't stop it. Mm-hmm. So all you can hope for is that the majority are normal, fair, and peace-minding people.
And what's your message to young people when you go and speak to them and you tell them your story and you tell them how things can change so utterly so quickly?
I always say, beware of charisma and beware of people who take you along, mm-hmm. and you get so involved that you don't know how to get out. And
now you have, your roots are here, you have your children and your grandchildren.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And hopefully some great-grandchildren in the future.
Oh, I would love that. I hope I live long enough. I think in my next life I'm going to be a maternity nurse. I love babies.
Well, I've got a couple I can lend you.
Anytime you like, anytime you like.
Oh, lovely. Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you talking to me.